In biology, a species is the basic unit of classification and a taxonomic rank of an organism, as well as a unit of biodiversity. A species is often defined as the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals of the appropriate sexes or mating types can produce fertile offspring, typically by sexual reproduction. Other ways of defining species include their karyotype, DNA sequence, morphology, behavior or ecological niche. In addition, paleontologists use the concept of the chronospecies since fossil reproduction cannot be examined. The total number of species is estimated to be between 8 and 8.7 million. However, only about 14% of these had been described by 2011. All species are given a two-part name. A. Binomial. The first part of a binomial is the genus to which the species belongs. The second part is called the specific name or the specific epithet. For example, boa constrictor is one of 4 species of the genus Boa, with constrictor being the species epithet. While the definitions given above may seem adequate at first glance, when looked at more closely they represent problematic species concepts. For example, the boundaries between closely related species become unclear with hybridization. In a species complex of hundreds of similar microspecies, and in a ring species. Also, among organisms that reproduce only asexually, the concept of a reproductive species breaks down, and each clone is potentially a microspecies, although none of these are entirely satisfactory definitions. And while the concept of species may not be a perfect model of life, it is still an incredibly useful tool to scientists and conservationists for studying life on Earth. Regardless of the theoretical difficulties, if species were fixed and clearly distinct from one another, there would be no problem. But evolutionary processes cause species to change continually, and to grade into one another. Species were seen from the time of Aristotle until the 18th century as fixed categories that could be arranged in a hierarchy. The Great Chain of Being. In the 19th century, biologists grasped that species could evolve given sufficient time. Charles Darwin's 1859 book On the Origin of Species explained how species could arise by natural selection. That understanding was greatly extended in the 20th century through genetics and population ecology. Genetic variability arises from mutations and recombination, while organisms themselves are mobile, leading to geographical isolation and genetic drift with varying selection pressures. Genes can sometimes be exchanged between species by horizontal gene transfer. New species can arise rapidly through hybridization and polyploidy, and species may become extinct for a variety of reasons. Viruses are a special case, driven by a balance of mutation and selection, and can be treated as quasi-species. Biologists and taxonomists have made many attempts to define species, beginning from morphology and moving towards genetics. Early taxonomists such as Linnaeus had no option but to describe what they saw. This was later formalized as the typological or morphological species concept. Ernst Mayr emphasized reproductive isolation, but this, like other species concepts, is hard or even impossible to test. Later biologists have tried to refine Mayer's definition with the recognition and cohesion concepts. Among others, many of the concepts are quite similar or overlap, so they are not easy to count. The biologist R. L. Maiden recorded about 24 concepts, and the philosopher of science John Wilkins counted 26. Wilkins further grouped the species concepts into 7 basic kinds of concepts. Ecospecies based on ecological niches, morphospecies based on form or phenotype, and taxonomic species. A species as determined by a taxonomist. A typological species is a group of organisms in which individuals conform to certain fixed properties. Species named in this manner are called morphospecies. In the 1970s, Robert R. Sokal, Theodore J. Crovallo and Peter Sneath proposed a variation on the morphological species concept. A phonetic species, defined as a set of organisms with a similar phenotype to each other, but a different phenotype from other sets of organisms. It differs from the morphological species concept in including a numerical measure of distance or similarity to cluster entities based on multivariate comparisons of a reasonably large number of phenotypic traits. A mate recognition species is a group of sexually reproducing organisms that recognize one another as potential mates, expanding on this to allow for post-mating isolation. A cohesion species is the most inclusive population of individuals having the potential for phenotypic cohesion through intrinsic cohesion mechanisms. No matter whether populations can hybridize successfully, they are still distinct cohesion species if the amount of hybridization is insufficient to completely mix their respective gene pools. A further development of